everyone. My name is Lucas. I'm an intern for the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness, and this is another presentation we're giving for the Our Homes, Our Votes. We've got a couple other segments you can check out on YouTube, and you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so first of all, we just want to talk about why it's important to help homeless individuals vote. This is from the National Alliance to End Homelessness's reasons to help homeless individuals vote, excuse me. So voting is a racial justice issue. Registering and educating people experiencing homelessness about voting and the voting process is a way to reduce this racial disparity. Homeless individuals are disproportionately people of color. And in the 2020 election, the Brennan Center found that 71% of white voters cast ballots compared to only 58% of non-white voters. So again, this is a racial justice issue. A lot of that discrepancy has to do with population density. People of color tend to wait in longer lines. The New York Times found that 7% of Latino voters 6.6% of Latino voters and 7% of Black voters reported waiting 30 minutes or longer to vote compared to only 4% of white voters. Latino voters waited on average 45% longer than white voters, and Black voters waited on average 45% longer than white voters. And in addition to that, COVID changed the way we vote and how homeless services operate. Things got switched to virtual. I think these ballot drop boxes that we saw pop up all over Michigan during COVID, any reason absentee, all of a sudden absentee ballots were sent to us. Voting services really changed, as did homeless services during the pandemic. And we don't know if people we're working with have really adapted to that yet. If they voted during the 2020 election cycle, these new rules may be news to them, and I think it's important to share that information. And additionally, a vote is a vote. People experiencing homelessness, their voices matter just as much as anybody else's. Often we're working with people who, feel a little bit disenfranchised from the rest of society. And, voting can be essential to making them feel like they're a part of something. Next slide. Yeah, so this is kind of a shocking stat. As few as 10% of homeless individuals vote, despite over 60% being eligible, and only about 1 in 3 are registered. So it's about 1 in 6 eligible homeless individuals are voting in our elections. That's a number that needs to go up. Next slide. Yeah, so these are just some important dates. Monday is passed. That was the last day to register online or through the mail. You can still register in person before this primary election, right up until 8 p.m. of election day. You just have to go to your clerk's office. The lines may be a little bit longer on election day. I recommend getting there a little bit sooner. The primary is Tuesday, August 2nd. You can request the absentee ballot. You can vote at home. That makes it a little bit easier. So yeah, you can spoil an absentee ballot by sending written notice to the city or township clerk. This request must be received by 5 p.m. the Friday before the election. So if you're concerned about your letter not getting there in time, I recommend going in and doing it in person. And voters may want to spoil their absentee ballots for a number of reasons. Sometimes a candidate, if they vote really early via absentee, sometimes their candidate will drop out. Other times, a candidate will say something that they don't particularly like and they just change their mind. Whatever the reason is, again, those need to be done the Friday before the election. So National Voter Registration Day, I'm sure that plenty of agencies will be holding events. That's September 20th, and then the primary election is November 8th. Next slide. Yeah, so this is what nonprofits can and cannot do. 501c3 nonprofits, I guess I should say. So you can register voters, you can help them to get registered. That can be done online, that can be done, in person with paper registrations. You can educate voters. That's what we're doing right now, so I hope we can do that. We can engage with candidates on issues. Sending out surveys and stuff like that is a popular way to do that. You can endorse ballot initiatives, and that's a key distinction between candidates, because in the second one, we're going to talk about how you cannot endorse candidates. But ballot initiatives, often that's school funding, public entity funding. I know in East Lansing, in Lansing, excuse me, it was on the ballot to fund the Potter Park Zoo a couple years ago. You can host election-related public events, and you can get voters to the polls. And there's a little bit more to that. So the law prohibits voter advocacy organizations from paying transportation to bring voters to and from the polls. Think rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft. You cannot pay them to have them do that, and they can also not reduce their rates in Michigan. That's a law. However, volunteers can drive potential voters to and from the polls. So that's an important distinction to make. Um, and again, at the bottom, all efforts have to remain nonpartisan. That's a really important thing. You don't want to be influencing the people you're working with. That should be their decision to make. And some things that nonprofits cannot do, you cannot make endorsements of any of the candidates, as we talked about earlier. You cannot donate money, resources, or time to any particular candidate. Again, this is 501c3s. 501c4s have a little bit different rules, but 501c3s specifically is what we're looking at. And any staff engaged in partisan political activities must do so without representing the organization and not on staff time. So if one of your staffers wants to go to a DNC, RNC event, whatever, you can't, you cannot pay for their time there because that's a partisan event. Next slide. Yeah, and so this is just a look at our new election maps. And you really don't have to get anything out of this. Just looking at the map, I guess, you wouldn't notice any changes from the old map, just glancing at it. But it is important to know that the voter map has changed. Some candidates that you voted for in past elections, maybe you're a state senator, state representative, for a couple of years, you could be voting for somebody different. There could be two sitting senators or representatives in districts that were next to each other. Now all of a sudden they're running against each other. So I recommend that you all look at your sample ballots and figure out exactly who you're voting for, because some people that are living close to the boundaries could be seeing different candidates than they have in the past. Next slide. Yeah, so the Secretary of State website, that's where I got a ton of the information that you're going to hear today, but I can't even begin to cover it all. I'd say that this is your top resource, anything and everything voting. It's outstanding. The Voter Education Center. So you can view your sample ballot, which I just mentioned, and check and update your registration. So say you move somewhere else, you can go right online. You can update your registration if you have the proper identification and things like that that you have to enter online. You can locate your clerk's office and polling places. So say you don't know how to go or where to go on election day, you can see where the closest ones are, where the closest precincts are. You can find out exactly where to vote, or if you need to talk to your clerk before the election, you can do that as well. You can track your absentee ballot. I know this was a big concern in 2020 when we saw so many absentee ballots sent out. A lot of people were using them for the first time. Yeah, so you can track your absentee ballot, actually figure out where it is, if it's gotten to the clerk yet, and if it hasn't, you can search for a reason why. You can also see equipment and services that are available at different voting precincts. So if you're working with voters with disabilities, there's different machines and things like that. There's some YouTube videos on their website that shows you exactly what those resources are. And then there's also links to county clerks' websites. So if you want a little bit more of a local look at things, all, 82 counties in Michigan, there's links to every single one of their county clerks' websites. A lot of times you can find information about candidates, you can find out their hours, who your clerk is, just handy stuff like that. Oh, and frequently asked questions. If you have a question, there's a good chance that somebody's asked it before you. Right on their website, they have a lot of those FAQs. Next slide. Yeah, so this is something that I thought was really interesting. This is a comparison between renters and homeowners, how much they vote every election cycle. As you can see, there's a huge difference. I mean, as much as 20% some election cycles. And I do think that's important because, I mean, all of these candidates, at least on the national level, and many of them even on the state level, they have these analytics guys and they know who's coming out to vote. That matters to them. And so if you want a particular policy passed, I think it's really important that we help people in these demographics, that we help get out to vote, because there's so many hurdles. I mean, think about basic protections like source of income that we've been looking at, things like that, that we have not been able to pass that would help renters. And then homeowners, they'll get tax credits. And I'm not complaining about that at all. but you can just see there's a difference in policy between renters and homeowners. And if this difference in the amount of people voting changes, maybe politicians will look a little bit more into what renters need. Uh, Next slide. Yeah, and again, income, and this could be for a lot of reasons. This could be because the lower demographic or the lower income people, excuse me, um, they can't get the time off work because they need that paycheck, or their job isn't as flexible with their hours. It could be because they've got to stay home and watch their kids because they can't afford childcare. There's a lot of reasons for this difference, but I don't think that income should be a determining factor for who's voting and who isn't. Um, and so making a plan on election day is really important because we have all these resources to early voting and things like that. And so if we share these resources that are available, it may help close this gap if people realize that they do have other options. Next slide. Yeah, so this is reasons for not voting out of town, forgot to vote. You can see them, there's, over a dozen of them. And it is a variety of reasons. So it's hard to zero in on just one, as we need to bring that down. But there's a number of approaches that we could take that would help with some of these. Some things, just educating voters about the candidates or the ballot questions or whatever it may be to help them get passionate about something, I think would help with a lot of it, those, especially the not interested category. Next slide. Yeah, so registering to vote. This part's really important. A lot of homeless individuals don't know that they can vote, and that goes back to, early American days where you had to own land to vote. So homeless individuals can register to vote using a shelter address, an address where you receive mail, a street corner park address, or the location of two cross streets, or a place you usually stay. That could be a friend's house, relatives, just a place you usually stay. People in Southeast Michigan, I really recommend that you utilize this mobile Secretary of State's office. I know the Secretary of State's very excited for it. I talked to their communications person, and they were trying to get the word out there about their mobile Secretary of State's office. It's this van. They come with a table and some computers. They can basically do anything that a Secretary of State's office would do. They told me that in particular homeless shelters they were looking to do services at, because they know there's a lot of people there that could use their services. They're hoping to get funding to expand statewide, but right now it's just in Southeast Michigan. So registration is available online with state ID. That could be your driver's license. There's also free state IDs that you could receive. And you can register in person up to 8 p.m. on election day using bank statement, utility bill, government document, etc.
One other quick thing, Luke, this is Lisa, I wanted to mention, is that we found out that people can use their HMIS ID as well. So that's beneficial for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, we can move on to the next slide. Yeah, so building interest. This is something that we talked about earlier. We hear it all the time. None of these candidates care about us. And I don't care who it is. They're all politicians. They're not the same, or they're all the same. And maybe sometimes after you help people to discover their candidates, they'll still hold those beliefs, and that's perfectly fine. We're not trying to force voting onto anybody. It's just helping people realize, the resources that are around them so they can make their own decisions. So the Secretary of State website, I've said it, probably 3 times already on this call. I'm going to say it again. There's just so many different resources on there to help you find out about your candidates. And we just sent out candidate surveys to all of the primary candidates that we could track down, hundreds of them. As we get those responses back, we're going to be posting them on our websites. The League of Women Voters has a ton of different resources on their website as well about different candidates. And then if you know who your candidates are, you can go to their website directly. That's a great place to find information. And so building interest, again, this is to help with people that are not interested, or maybe some of those other reasons they won't matter as much if they get really passionate about a candidate. And Yeah, and another thing I think is important to note is if you vote, you don't have to fill out an entire ballot. Maybe there's just one candidate on that ballot that you really like, and you can vote for them and not fill out anything else. That vote counts just the same as anybody else's. And lastly is ballot questions, which we're about to go over in a second. Even if you don't like politicians, there's a lot of people that don't like politicians. Ballot questions, they can affect school funding, they can affect different entities that are getting funding. And then we're going to go over the state ones, the statewide ballot questions in just a second. Next slide. Yep. So these are the three initiatives that could potentially be on our on every ballot in Michigan in November. The Voters for Transparency and Term Limits. And this, what I'm about to read to you is from Bridge, Michigan. Bridge, Michigan has a live ballot tracker. They update it, since I've been looking at it, it seems like it's updating, weekly. I don't know if it'll continue if these do get put on the ballot, but I think it's a great thing to check in on because it will tell you what's happening. And so just to quickly go over these three, which could potentially be on the ballot. This first one, the Voters for Transparency and Term Limits. So what that does is the ballot measure would amend the state constitution to reduce the maximum length a lawmaker can serve in legislature from 14 years down to 12 years, but it would allow them to serve the full tenure in one chamber. Currently, lawmakers can serve up to 6 years in the Michigan House and 8 years in the Senate. So you'd have to serve in both the House and the Senate to reach that full 14-year high point currently. Right now, or if this passes, then you could do 12 years either house. And you could stay in that same position the entire time. So this would be a constitutional amendment. It would also require state lawmakers, the governor, the secretary of state, and the state attorney general to disclose certain financial information, including description of assets, sources of all forms of income, description of liabilities, positions held outside of their elected office, arrangements regarding future employment, continuing benefits from former employees other than the state, and payments and gifts received by lobbyists. So that's an overview of that transparency and term limits. The name's pretty self-explanatory. It changes the term limits a little bit, and it requires some more transparency from elected officials. And so these next two have met the submission deadline for signatures. There was a third one recently. They looked through it, it got taken off. They go through a process of randomly sampling signatures to see if they look real or not. And so one was recently taken off, but there's still two left. So Promote the Vote 2022. So it was a coalition of voting rights groups that primarily pushed this out to reach the signature requirement. And it seeks to amend the state constitution to allow 9 days of early voting, publicly subsidize absentee ballots and a tracking system for ballot locations, continue to allow registered voters without a state ID to sign an affidavit attesting to their identity, and it would allow public sources and charities to fund elections subject to disclosure rules. It allows future voters to register for absentee ballots for all future elections. Again, so you wouldn't have to re-register every election. It's from here on out, I'd like to receive an absentee ballot. It would require ballot drop boxes for every 15,000 voters in a municipality. I think that's important. Right now, how it's working is, we talked with the Secretary of State a little bit, is individual clerks offices, they can request funding to install ballot drop boxes, but if they don't have the funds available, then they can't. This would require, it'd be a population dependent requirement. You've got more people, you've got more drop boxes. It would establish that post-election audits can only be conducted by state and local officials, and it would require canvass boards to only certify election results based on the official vote counts. This is a constitutional amendment proposal. So where this stands right now, they submitted just about 670,000 signatures. The Bureau of Elections will review the random samples of those signatures, and the Board of Canvassers will decide if the group has enough ballot signatures to qualify for the November ballot. If approved by a majority of voters in November, the measure would take place 45 days after Election Day. And lastly, reproductive freedom for all. This has been in the news after Roe v. Wade. So the measure would amend the state constitution to make reproductive freedoms a right, repealing a decades-old law that made abortion a felony. The law was set taken effect after Roe v. Wade was struck down. However, a Michigan judge has issued an injunction which blocked the state law from being enforced. So the group submitted a record 753,000 signatures, the most in state history, I guess I should say. The Bureau of Elections will review random samples of those signatures, and the Board of Canvassers will decide whether the group has enough valid signatures to qualify for the November ballot. If approved by a majority of voters in November, the measure would take place 45 days after Election Day. And so that's just a quick rundown on those three. Again, everything I just read off came from Bridge, Michigan. There's even more about them. They got things like who is backing these ballot initiatives and what the opposition says. So I can't recommend enough checking out Bridge's ballot initiative tracker. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so voting early. This picture on the right here, that's what a ballot drop box looks like. I'm sure they, everyone's seen one. Oftentimes they're outside of clerks' offices. There's one outside of the local library. I know of in East Lansing, public spaces. So all Michigan voters are eligible to vote absentee. That was a 2018 ballot initiative that passed. So before you need a reason, now anybody can do it. You can request the absentee ballot online. It can be mailed to the local clerk, put in one of these drop boxes that you see in the drop box locations can be found on the Secretary of State website. If mail sent, I don't want to give you guys a date because I don't want there to be an issue with the mail. And then you say, well, he said a week earlier or anything like that. Send the absentee ballots well in advance of Election Day, just to make sure they arrive on time. And to avoid potential mailing delays, it is strongly recommended you request your absentee ballot no later than 14 days prior to the election. That's from the Secretary of State. And if you get the ballot later than you'd like, you can find one of these drop boxes or directly with the clerk to drop it off. Again, if you're concerned about mailing delays, these drop boxes, you can find them right on the Secretary of State website. That can avoid any delays. Next slide. Yeah, so local clerks offices. Michigan has 83 counties, 280 cities, and 1,240 townships. Clerks offices can be found at all three levels. Find the closest clerk's office at the Michigan Voter Information Center, as I just mentioned. So clerk's offices, they can register voters, they can request absentee ballots, they can track absentee ballots, and they can answer questions. That's the big one. Prior to coming to MICA, I was a reporter during the 2020 election cycle in Northern Michigan. I was calling the clerks 3 times a day because I was writing stories about the election constantly. And they had all the answers. If they didn't, then they'd send me emails back. Really, that's just going to be your top spot to get information is your local clerk. Everything through the elections goes through them. Yeah, and another thing that a lot of people don't know is that city and township clerks offices must be open during their normal hours for at least 8 hours that Saturday or Sunday before each election. So it can be either Saturday or Sunday, but if you need to get into your clerk for anything the weekend before the election, give them a call. They'll tell you which day they'll be open. Next slide. So this is resources and assistance with some voters that may have special needs. So voters who are blind, disabled, or unable to read or write may be assisted by a person of their choosing, as long as it is not their employer, an agent of their employer, an officer or agent of their labor union. So it could be a friend. If you're working in homeless services, you could help your clients, even family members, whatever, just work involvement that's not allowed. So disability should not prevent anyone from voting. So there's equipment that can help people that are blind or struggling to read. There's equipment on the Secretary of State's website that you can see. There's 3 different voting softwares that they use, and each have different machines. But there's videos for all 3 of those, how they work, on the Secretary of State website. Or again, you can call your clerk. You can ask about the voting system they use and the machines that they have to assist. And each polling place should have at least one voting terminal where voters can remain seated. So people who are in wheelchairs, stuff like that, they won't have to, obviously stand to vote. There's seated options for voting. Next slide. Yeah, so voters who speak languages other than English. So the Secretary of State's website does have browser translators for Google Chrome, Safari, and Microsoft Edge. If you use a different browser translator, I'd imagine you can find one online just from looking it up. And all of these online resources we've talked about today, you can have those translated to whatever languages you may need using these browser translators. So there's a couple different areas in Michigan. It's not really prevalent in Michigan, but there's a couple different areas that have populations that speak a language other than English as their first language. So in Colfax Township or the city of Benville, ballots are available in Spanish. In Hamtramck, you have the right to a ballot and election materials in Bengali. If the ballot isn't available in someone's language, it's the same rules that applies for someone who may be blind or struggles to read. They can bring someone who is not their employer, an agent of their employer, or an office or representative of their labor union. So same rules there. Next slide. Yeah, so voting if charged with or convicted of a crime. I know that there's a lot of discrepancy of this because from state to state, this varies greatly. In some states, people who are felons cannot vote. That is not the case in Michigan. People convicted of felonies or misdemeanors in Michigan have the right to vote after they're released from prison or jail. Michiganders can register and vote while on probation or parole. If necessary, you can ask your agent to leave your home to vote well before election day, or you can vote absentee. So ask well ahead of time, and if your probation officer won't let you leave, just request an absentee ballot. You can still do it from your home. And if you are awaiting trial and have not yet been convicted, you can still vote. So right up until your conviction, until you're sentenced, you can vote. So the big thing is, really, this is the only type of person who's going through the legal system who cannot vote, is if you're convicted and currently serving that sentence. And all that information is from the ACLU of Michigan. Next slide. Yeah, so we just want to, if anybody has any questions, we have a few different contacts with the Secretary of State that said they'd be happy to answer any questions. You can email me at lbay@mihomeless.com, and I'd be happy to forward those to the Secretary of State. And that's it. That's all we got for you. Thanks everyone for watching.